Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here in Stockholm, in this sunny Stockholm, while it's raining in Paris. So it's even more pleasant. Thanks a lot for the introduction. I am really a kind of outsider here, in the sense that I will talk to you about some problems of compressed sensing, so problem of signal processing in some sense, while I am a physicist. And I think it's some aspect of it which is very interesting. I first mentioned my collaborators. So the talk is based mostly on some works that we did in the last 2 or 3 years, mostly with Florent Zakala and Lenka Zdeborova, and a number of other people who have joined us who are quoted here on the slide. So I was reading on the web what is this access center that I come to give a talk to, and so I found this beautiful sentence: at the access center we are finding ways to facilitate communication between people, systems and machine. And as Alexandre was saying just before, I have a strong commitment in the fact that I think that we are this moment of science at a moment where there is a possibility of convergence of ideas, techniques, concepts, coming from various fields, from information theory, computer science, physics. And I have been kind of active in this field, and I want to show you how we can address the same kind of questions with different visions, and in some cases it can be, I think, very fruitful. So let me give, I will start with a kind of general perspective and a small introduction to compressed sensing. I apologize to those of you who are experts in the audience. I don't know exactly who is expert, who is not, but it will give at least some introduction, and it will also give my view of compressed sensing as a physicist again. So in some sense, a very broad perspective, when people ask you, often it happens, they tell you, what is the big challenge of science in the next century or something? And that's a very question. One aspect of it which I think is inevitable, and there is an obvious answer to that, is everything which is related to big data, how to make sense of it, how to analyze it, and of course trying to focus on relevant information. And some part of it has to do, which is the thing that I will discuss today, has to do about how to acquire data faster, assuming that the underlying world has some structure, is structured. And compressed sensing, I see it as one step in this direction. So in a broad sense, this is what it is all about. You have some data with n components, and you want to acquire this data by doing a number of measurements which is much smaller than n. This, in general, it may be possible only if the signal is compressible, in the sense that its information content is much less than n bits. But probably all the interesting signals all the signals that interest you are in this category. So it has a lot of possible applications. Of course, making progress in magnetic resonance imaging, in the sense of making it faster, is something which is a very practical application. Also tomography and microscopy, image acquisition, generalized linear regression, group testing, and I think also a lot of things that are not usually mentioned as belonging to the field of compressed sensing, but I can see them as some natural perspective for this field if you consider the evolution of the field in the next few years. For instance, some very interesting problems in coming from biology, like inferring the regulatory interactions between many genes using gene expression data, which in nature have to be done in a number of experimental conditions, which is obviously very limited. And another aspect, which is even maybe further away, but which I find fascinating, is the fact that if you look at how information is processed in the brain, there are instances where you have flow information which need some compression, and otherwise need some representing the information on a much larger number of neurons than initially, with some kind of sparse representation. And I think that there is an interaction between these two steps of computation, which is also very interesting. So let me give just 3 examples before I get into the slightly more detailed aspects of the talk. The first aspects I want to give you is one on which we are actually working at the moment, which is tomography binary mixtures. So here is a slice of a sample. It's a binary sample. It's a growth of a crystal inside some other material, and you want to analyze it by tomography. So by tomography, how do you do that? You go to your favorite synchrotron, and you flash light, synchrotron light on it, arriving here, and then you have some camera, and you detect the light which has gone through the sample. So basically what you measure here is that you measure the total absorption. So you measure something like a density, the integral of a density of absorption of light along one ray. And you get data for, let's say that you have a camera with L pixels, so you have L measurements for each angle. And typically what people do is that they take this sample and they rotate it, one angle, another angle, and so on. Each time you get L measurements, okay? And so basically, if you imagine that you turn and you do measurements with L angles, you have available L square measurements, and you will typically, with standard method, you will get a resolution of L squared pixels. That's the normal thing. And how you do that? You do that by inverse radon transform, basically, and something which is very now. The question which I want to ask is the following. Imagine that the size of the domains, the crystal growth that you are looking at, the typical size of the domain is much larger than this size, which let me say that the global size of the sample is 1, the size of the pixel is 1 over L, and the typical size of the domain is intermediate between them. So it's much larger than the pixel. So it is clear that the information content of this image is not L squared, it's more than that. So you should be able to acquire this data by doing less measurements than these L angles. Okay, and that's exactly a compressed sensing issue. That is, you want to measure this image by doing much less measurement than what would be absolutely required if you want to do the perfect reconstruction with the radon transform. And you can do that only. You cannot do that for an arbitrary image. If it is totally arbitrary, there is nothing that you can do. But if this image is structured, and if you have an idea of the structure, you can do it by putting some information. Here, the is the fact that the image is built out of domains. So for instance, for this image that I'm showing here, so digitalized on a 1,000 by 1,000 grid, so it has 1 million pixels, you can reconstruct it, we can reconstruct it using our method by doing 16 measurements. Okay, each measurement is 1,000 numbers, but it's only 16,000 with respect to 1 million. So it's a very strong speed up of the thing. Of course, usual in science and in physics in particular, if you are able to gain a factor 100 on the measurement, then you have access to a lot of new things. You have access to the time dynamics of the growth of the samples, and that's typically the kind of motivation that we have on that. So that was a first example to give you an idea of the motivation. And now the second one I want to show is another amusing and a nice problem, very easy to understand, which is group testing. To the celebrated idea of Dorfman in 1943. So he was interested in the following probabilistic problem. It was a problem. It was a time where the soldiers in the U.S. were drafted and they were tested for syphilis, and so it was a kind of a costly test and so on. And knowing that the prevalence of syphilis is not that high, he said, well, maybe there would be a way to do more efficient tests. And so the simplest idea that you can do is to pool the test. That is here, for instance, in the drawing here, you group the people by 3. You you mix the blood, you do the blood test for groups of 3, and if a test is red, it means that there is syphilis there, then you test all the 3 individuals. And if a test is white, it says these 3 individuals are safe. Okay? And now you can do a very small, it's an exercise you can give to your students in first year. You tell them you do n over k groups of k person, and you do this testing, and you say what is the best value, what is the optimal value of the number of tests, of the size of the test. Okay? And if p is the probability that someone is infected, assuming that p is very small, you realize that the average number of tests that you need is the expression that is here. I will not detail the computation, but I think it's elementary. And then you find that it is minimal for of test, which is 1 over square root of the probability of infection. And it gives you on average a number of tests which scales like 2 square root of p times n. So if p is small, you have gained a lot with respect to the standard procedure, which would be just n tests. That's another example in some sense of a compressed sense, the sense that is usually referred to. But, and actually, I want to mention that this procedure is the one that you can give to your students, but then there are much better ways of grouping the tests in the sense that you can also pool the people in overlapping groups. And what, for instance, we showed in a few years ago with Toninelli is that if you organize it based on a random graph, you can get the precision, the number of tests which is written down there, which scales like n times p log p instead of square root of p, which is much better, of course. And the third example is just an image taken from a famous paper by Lustig et al., which is an example from magnetic resonance imaging, in which the left image has been acquired with compressed sensing and with a speed up of a factor 2.5 with respect to the right-hand side image. And so it may be, okay, one may dispute or not whether 2.5 is a good factor or not, but for all the people who have gone in these MRI machines, it seems that it's not very comfortable. And also, at least, you typically have to wait for a month or something to get into this machine. So if you can speed it up even by a factor 2 or 3, that's something very interesting. So that was just to give you some motivation. Now let me go into the problem, and I want to describe the problem in the purest setting. I go now to the more canonical. Okay, I have presented for you my view of compressed sensing, which is a kind of very broad framework. Now I focus on something which is a more conventional view, and the conventional view is so far, for no good reason, but okay, that's something else. For no good reason, conventional view has focused on a substance, which is the case in which one does linear measurements. So I show here the pure problem. The pure problem is the following. You have a signal. The signal S, it's built from n components, S1, Sn, n numbers. And you do a number of measurements on this signal. So it could be Fourier transform, it could be Radon transform, it could be wavelets, whatever. And and then you do m measurements. And the result of the measurements are in this vector ym. Full measurement procedure is described by a matrix m times n, the matrix called F, and we have a linear set of measurements y equal fs. Okay, and you have the following problem. You know your measurement procedure, so you know the measurement matrix, Fourier or whatever, the one that you prefer. You know the result, you have observed the results of the measurement, so the vector y, and you want to reconstruct the signal. Okay, simple enough. Now, there is one case in which you can do that. It's a case where m equal n, you inverse the matrix, the result. Now, the big problem of compressing is how do you reconstruct the signal S when m is less than n? But then you need to add, of course, some information. And the information that we will use here is the fact that the signal, you assume that it is sparse. So the fact that it is sparse, it means that the signal has quite a few of its components which are 0. And that is based on this idea that nature's interesting signals in some bases, in some appropriate bases, they tend to be sparse. That's very well known in image processing. You go to wavelet transform, and you have a lot of the wavelet coefficients which are very small. And let us, I will discuss later on some elaboration on that, but let us look at the pure case in which you have a signal in some appropriate basis has many components which are just zero. And then we will go from 0 to approximately 0. It will be some kind of noisy version of the pure problem. So the problem is the following. We have a signal S. It is sparse in the sense that it has only R components which are non-zero. And then you measure, you do the measurement Y, which is a linear set of measurement. And let us assume that the number of non-zero components of the signal R is less than M, the number of measurements, which is less than n, the total number of components. In this case, it is possible to reconstruct the signal. And how do you do that? Well, you study this linear system, y equal fx, is underdetermined a priori, but you exploit the sparsity of the original signal. So let me give you a simple solution to the problem. How do you do that? Let's say if you have no problem of time, of algorithmic complexity. So a simple solution is the following. Let me guess the positions of the components xi which are non-zero. So for instance, the first guess that I do, I that the first R components are non-zero and the other ones are zero. Let me try to see if it's correct or not. I look at that. So I have this first R component which are non-zero. Now I look at my linear system. You see that it reduced to y equal g times the first R component of x. So now I overdetermined system. Generically, if I have not made the right choice, if my guess was not right, this overdetermined system has no solution. It has more equation than unknown. So in general, it has no solution. The only case in which it has solution is in which I did the good guess. That's the generic situation. So something that's just to tell you the idea. Let's say it's a very simple linear algebra to give you an idea of how it works in general. So this tells you that in principle, just with this very simple-minded algorithm, as soon as m, the number of measurements, is larger than the number of non-zero components, and again for generic matrix F, you will find the solution that way. The only drawback of this problem, of this algorithm, is that you have to test all the guesses. So you have n guesses, and for any reasonable size problem, it's not an algorithm that you can use, of course. So people have a lot of effort to go beyond that, and most of the efforts actually have been dedicated to an approach which is a regularization of the problem. First, a formulation of the problem as an optimization problem, and regularization with the L1 norm. So how is it done? Well, you reformulate the problem as follows. You want this component vector x such that it satisfies the linear system of measurement, it's compatible with your measurement, and you want it to be sparse, and you want it to be as sparse as possible. So what you will do is that you will minimize some norm of x. And the best thing actually would be to minimize the norm. That is, you would like to find the vector which has the smallest possible number of non-zero components compatible with the data. If you are able to do that, you will reconstruct the signal. In practice, this is very, very hard to do. It's an NP-hard problem. What people have studied a lot is the relaxation of this approach to using L1 norm. That is, you minimize the sum of the absolute value of xi in the subspace y equal fx. And I should say that there is also the noisy version of the problem, which is the case in which the measurement has some added noise, but I will only mention it in the end. So this L1 norm approach has been extremely popular in the last few years with very interesting work, in particular pioneer works by Candace and Tao, Dono, etc. And let me summarize a little bit some of the results, and I will focus on the results which are the one which are closest to the physicist that I am. For the physicist, the thing that is not so much the worst case analysis, but what happens in a typical case. Typical case analysis. So the question that we ask is, we will define an ensemble of problems. For instance, the ensemble which the measurement is based is sampled from some distribution. Typically, people use a lot random matrices in which all the entries are independent Gaussian random variables. And then you want to understand when is it possible to reconstruct, when is it not possible, by looking at what in physics we call the thermodynamic limit. What is a thermodynamic limit? It's a case in which the number of variables goes to infinity. The number of measures, m, also goes to infinity proportionally to the number of variables. So we define alpha, m equal alpha m. Is the number of measures per variable. And let us say that the density, the number of non-zero component of the signal, also scales with n, r equal rho times n. So rho is the density of non-zero variables. So the thing that I want to understand is the phase diagram of this problem. The phase diagram is something which is very well defined in this thermodynamic limit that I was mentioning here, in the large n limit, keeping rho and alpha fixed. And we will see that in this phase diagram, there are regions of the phase diagram where we are able to reconstruct the signals and regions where we are not. So there is already one region that you know, that I have shown you, which is the diagonal line alpha equal rho. Rho means that we have, if alpha is larger than rho, it means that we have more measurements than non-zero variables. And then the naive algorithm, the very stupid algorithm I was showing you before, works. So there is above this blue diagonal line, so this is the phase diagram in the plane rho, which is a fraction of non-zero variable, and alpha, which is the number of elements per variable. Above the blue line, the naive algorithm works. It works in principle. It's horribly slow, but it works. And now the result of the red curve, which is here, gives you the boundary above which the L1 relaxation gives you the correct result. So it's called the Donau-Tanner threshold. Donau-Tanner threshold is this red curve. So again, let me show it more in detail here. We have three regions in this phase diagram. We have the region which is in gray on in the region of low alpha, below the diagonal. The reconstruction is impossible. There is not enough information. Whatever the algorithm, you are missing information. There is a green region. The green region is the one in which it's possible to reconstruct the signal by doing linear programming, basically by the L1 relaxation, convex optimization if you go to the noisy case. And there are various very efficient ways to do that, including message passing solutions for that. And then there is this, the white region in the center is a region which, you know that in principle it would be possible, but it's just that the algorithm that you have, at least the one that I have shown you before, is much too slow to be used. Of course, in the green region, I have not said it, but you have very efficient, very, very fast algorithm to do things. So, a couple of years ago, with Florent Ksakala, François Saucé, Yifan Sun, and Lenka Zdeborova, we this problem by using a kind of alternative approach, not the L1 approach, but our goal is really to try to get into this this intermediate region and show that it's possible to have reconstruction of the signal even in this intermediate region. So to gain with respect to the L1 relaxation. L1 is bound to, I mean, there is no way that you can make progress with L1 the green region. L1 has modified the problem in such a way that it's no longer an algorithmic problem. You have modified the measure of the problem. So below this line, it will never make. So the way that we address the problem was a combination of three ingredients: a probabilistic approach, like a kind of Bayesian approach, a message passing reconstruction of the signal, and a careful design of the measurement matrix. And each of these ingredients has been tried in the past in various aspects and so on, but it's a subtle combination of all the three that works. And actually, the way it works, it requires a lot of physical understanding of the problem, and I will give you some clues about why it is so. So the first step is the following. The first step has to do with defining a probabilistic approach to compressed sensing. So imagine for definiteness, let us imagine a signal that has been generated from the following measure. It is independent component. It has a density rho naught. So with probability 1 minus rho naught, the component is 0, Si is 0. And with probability rho naught, you draw the signal at random from some distribution phi naught, which is that you prefer depending on your problem. And now, let me, for decoding, I will address the decoding problem with the following measure, which is written here. First of all, the notation with the delta function is the one that we use always in physics. It means that we focus on the subspace of the vector x that satisfy the measurement, that are compatible with the measurement. Okay, we have the M equation that are enforced, and then we have a kind of prior on the component of the signal, and the prior says that we assume that components of the signal are non-zero with probability rho, and when they are non-zero, I put just a Gaussian prior. So I have what is called a Gauss-Bernoulli prior. Okay, and I insist here it's very important to notice that rho and phi of x, so phi is just a Gaussian distribution. So my Gauss-Bernoulli signal is not necessarily matched to my Gauss-Bernoulli prior is not necessarily matched to the original problem, to the original signal. It may be quite different. Now, we proved a first theorem that is not totally intuitive. It's summarized as follows. If rho naught is less than 1, it means that the original signal is sparse. If rho is less than 1, it means that in my prior, I am assuming that there is some sparsity. If alpha is larger than rho naught, it means that I have more measurements than non-zero component. For f, a random Gaussian in the large n limit, the maximum of this probability distribution P of x is at x equal s. And that is, the fact that is not obvious is that this is true even if we don't have the right prior. If we have not, of course, the more information we have about the signal, we should use it. We should put it in the prior. But even if we have not a very perfect information, you see, it's a very general condition that P of x is completely dominated by the signal itself. So that's a good news because it tells you that this probabilistic approach is a good way to address this problem. You just need to sample from this P of x. If you sample from this P of x, you will reach the most probable configuration is the signal itself. And of course, I have not written it here, but in the large size limit, in the large number of components, there is a large deviation function. I say that the P of x is maximum at x equal s. It is actually, there is a large deviation principle, so it will be completely dominated by x equal s. So if you really, for large n, if you are able to sample from that, you get the result, you get the signal. Even if you don't know the correct measure for the signal. So that gives you at least a probabilistic framework which is well defined. Now, the second step is the following. You want to sample from this constraint measure, from what I call the constraint measure, which is here. So we have this measure. We know from the theorem that the stored signal xi equal s is, in the large n limit, infinitely more probable than other configurations. Is it possible to get it? So, of course, how do you do that? Well, it's how to sample from such a measure. Probably one first guess, at least many physicists would start to say, well, I will do that by Monte Carlo Markov chain, for instance. That would be typical of a first approach. And that's one possibility. But the problem is that here a method that is fast because we want to use it for large-scale application. And that's not the case for the Monte Carlo for this problem. And the second problem that we see is that we need a method that really converges to the native configuration. And here we face a problem which is a problem which we know very well in physics. If I take a system of particles in physics, interact by some potential, typically there are some regions when the temperature is low enough, like when it's freezing at night and so on, there is one state which is favored, which is a crystalline state. where the particles are basically ordered in a crystalline lattice. And from the point of view of the Bose structure, this was much more, infinitely more probable than all the other distributions of particles. Yet we know that in some cases it is very difficult to get a good crystal. And why is it so? Because even nature, which has a lot of the time available to crystallize and so on with respect to the basic time scale of movement of the atoms, let's say, even nature sometimes does not succeed in making a nice because the system does not find the most probable state, and that is typically the situation of transition. The system which cools and stays blocked in a glass configuration, which is a metastable state. It's not the right crystal. It's not the optimal of the measure. And so that is another problem that we face. So in order to address these two questions, we used we wanted to have a fast method for that, and we used a physical method which is called mean field. And in this context, it is actually belief propagation with Gaussian approximated messages and parameter learning. So these are ingredients. Let's sketch it because it can become technical if one wants to get into the detail. But let me give some idea of how it goes. I mean, belief propagation is something that has actually been it's a message passing procedure which has been very popular in the last few years, especially in this field at the interface of physics and in theory. For instance, in error correcting code, it's used a lot, and it is in context, at least, it's the mean field equations. So here is how it goes. Let me here. I have given again the measure from which I want to sample my problem. I have this measure as it involves a certain number of variables. Xi, they are the blue circles which are up there, and then each variable appears in a certain number of constraints, and the constraints are given by the measurement. So each measurement, y mu equals sum of f mu I xi, is characterized by a square here, and I have what is called this factor graph, which relates the variable and the constraint. It happens that in this problem, because the matrix f mu I has all IID elements non-zero, each constraint involves all the variables. So it's in physics term, it's called a long-range system. It's a system in which the interaction between the variable is long-range. There is no locality. It means that each variable gives a contribution to all the constraints, but a small contribution because a constraint involves all the variables. And so because of that, that's something that is very well known in I will not try to just it fully here. It is a case in which the mean field method becomes exact. And mean field means what? It means that we can describe the system by local order parameters. In this case, the local order parameters are the following. You look at this factor graph and imagine that you erase the constraint number mu. And then you define what is the average value of xi in the absence of mu. And this I call this a I to mu. It's called like a message which will go from I to mu. And then I have v, which is I to mu, which is a variance of this same variable in the absence of mu. These two numbers, I will be able to write self-consistent equation relating these numbers. These are closed self-consistent equations. In various contexts, they are called BP, TAP, GAMP. They are renamed each time they are used. They are equations which have been discovered many years ago. Probably the first instance was in some computations of Hans Bethe in the 40s about the Ising model. And then there was a message passing solution of Gallagher for his error correcting code. So many rediscoveries of these equations. So these belief propagation equations, they are written here. I don't want you to understand them. It's just to show you that they exist. And they are written in terms of basically 4 messages on each edge of the factor graph, each edge connecting one variable I to a constraint, a measurement mu. There are 4 which are circulating. These are the mean and the variance, basically of the variable which is on the endpoint of the edge. So basically, we have 4 messages sent along each edge. These are 4 NM numbers, and there are some actually simpler version of this equation, which can be simplified to order n parameters. These equations, they are, so you can update this equation, you can write the update for the message passing, you can iterate it on a given graph and see where it goes. And if it converges, it should give you, for instance, the mean of the xi. And if the measure that you have has converged to the right signal, the mean of xi should be the signal. So from this you get the signal. So I will not. I have a couple of technical sides here which I will just keep, which is just to mention there is a problem of validity of this mean field BP equation. And here we have at least one result which is interesting, which is actually very important. If we have the right prior, that is, if in our measure we have the right, we know the statistics of the signal, put it in the measure, then we know that these equations are exact. So that's something which is, that's the simplest situation, let's say. And if we don't have the right measure, there is a way to approach the right measure by doing what is called parameter learning. That is that we can let evolve in the course of iterating the BP equation, we can evolve the effective density and the mean and width of the Gaussian, of the Gauss-Bernoulli process, in such a way that we maximize the likelihood that the model that we have is characterizing the actual data that we have. So that's something that is standard. I will not explain it in detail, but it can be done. But it means that we can get closer to, even if we didn't have the right original guess, we can get closer to the real statistics of the signal, first of all. And if we have the right statistics of the signal, we know that the procedure is exact. So asymptotically, we are in good shape. So now I have given you the 2 main ingredients. We have this probabilistic approach based on this measure, and then we have this belief propagation equation that I have not written in all their full glory here, but you can understand that they exist and they are written in the papers and so on and so forth. Now, what can you do with that? You can do 2 things. We can just simulate things. That is, we take an instance of the problem, we iterate the BP equation, we look at the expectation value of the variable, we compare it to the original signal. Is it good? Is it not good? Do we reconstruct the signal or not? And then it turns out that on top of the equation, we can also do something which is an analytical study of the large n limit of this problem. And this is based on methods that were invented starting in the early 80s in the statistical physics of disordered system. What you have to, just to give you some background on that, what you have to understand is that here we have a typical problem of statistical physics. It's a weird problem of statistical physics, but it is one of them. That is, you have n variable, n becomes very large, thermodynamic limit. So in physics, n is 10 to the 23. Well, here maybe n is it's large. We have a basic measure for the variable. This is the Gauss-Bernoulli measure. And then we have this kind of the constraints which are here, which tell me that y mu equals sum of f mu I xi. These constraints make fractions between the variable. That is, if I change one variable xi, and I want to satisfy the constraint, it means some other variable must change in reaction. So we have these interacting variables. They interact by some set of the interaction constants here, given by this measurement matrix y. These are numbers, basically, in this case. And so this is typical of what we have studied a lot in the 80s in statistical physics, in which we had spin variables which interact with random interaction. And we developed a number the community developed a number of methods to address that. And the 2 main methods, actually very closely related, is called the replica method and the cavity method. And that's what we have imported in this field in order to get the analytical result. So the analytical result gives the following. With the replica, you can compute the following object. Imagine that you look at the probability that the constructed x, the signal that you are looking at, the reconstructed one x, is at distance d from the original signal. Okay, so you look at this probability measure, and basically you look at the weight of this probability measure at a distance d from the original signal. And because of large deviation, the thing that is relevant is 1 over n of this probability. This is called the potential. And this potential, we can compute it by replica method. Again, I will not explain how one does that, but I will give you the result. And then we have another method, which is a cavity method, which shows that when you do the algorithm, the belief propagation iteration, it flows according to the gradient of this potential, this free, what is called the free entropy. And so this means that from the combination of this function phi of d, of this free entropy, we can have access to a control of what the algorithm does. And okay, so I should state a few caveats here. The replica method is replica and cavity method are two beautiful techniques, but they are not always fully under control because some of the hypotheses are very hard to test. It turns out that in some regime it's possible to have a full analytic control of the approach, and in particular for compressed sensing, there have been recently nice works by Montanari and Montanari confirming that the procedure that I will show you here is actually correct. So here is the result. Here I show you this potential, this free entropy phi of d as function of d, the distance to native state. So on the left figure, d equals 0 means x equals s. And phi of d is basically the weight of the measure at distance d from the original state. You see that this, so it's a log of the probability. You see that d equals 0. That's what I was telling you before. That's my theorem. It tells me that my measure is really dominated by the signal itself. That's the thing that is nice. Now, let us look. So here there are 4 curves. Let us look, for instance, at the curve, the top one, alpha equals 0.62. So this is a signal which has density 0.4. Okay, it has 40% of the components which are non-zero. And I do a measurement with alpha equal 0.62. That means I have 62% is the ratio of number of measurements per variable. So that's the curve which is there, the blue curve. And you see that it gives me the probability as function of the distance. It's monotonous. And then I know from the cavity that what the algorithm does, it does a gradient flow. So I start at large distance because I initialize my messages completely randomly. I have no hint, no clue of what is the signal. I start at large d, and then by just gradient ascent of this thing, the iteration of the cavity will reach d equals 0 very smoothly. And so in this case, the algorithm converge and reconstruct that signal. Now, let us look at the bottom curve, alpha equals 0.56, for instance. Still dominated by d equals 0. The signal is still dominant. But now if I start from large distance, you see that I get trapped at a maximum. I go with a gradient, and I get trapped at the maximum, which is distance 0.5 from the original signal. It means that I don't reconstruct the original signal. In this case, I'm trapped. I'm lost at a certain distance from the original signal. The measure itself, it just means that my BP is not able to sample very well. I'm not sampling. If I would sample correctly, I would sample from d equals 0. I would get the original. So this is what we get. And actually, we also can compute from that the conversion time of the BP, and this is given in the right-hand plot, which is here. So here is the number of iteration of the message passing versus alpha, which is the density of constraint. And you look at the blue curve, and you see that for large alpha, when you have many measurement, the many measurement is enough, and you converge rapidly towards the solution, solution within a solution. And then you see that at some, which is here alpha 59. The convergence time diverges. The time for the system to reach the original signal diverges. The system, it gets trapped. It's no longer able to. So in physical terms, it means that if I go below 0.59, I still have this crystalline state. It exists. It's the original signal. But the dynamics is not able to reach it, and it gets trapped. It gets trapped, and the dynamics becomes more and more sluggish. It's very slow, and actually, for convergence, diverges at alpha equal 0.59. So this is the BP convergence threshold. This is called alpha RBP in this plot. Here it is 0.59 for a system of density 0.4. And the thing that is good news is that if I look at the L1 threshold, the L1 threshold, it's the separation between blue and green here, it was around 0.75. So it means that here already with this procedure, we have gained a lot with respect to F1. We have gone from a threshold, the Dono and we go down to 0.59. So we have entered a forbidden region in some sense. Now, just to show you that all this is rather well under control, here on the left-hand side, I plot the distance to the native state as function of the number of iterations of the message passing. The curves are the analytic prediction done from this cavity method of analysis, and the dots are simulations with large. So you see that depending on the number of constraints, with a large number of constraints, it works very well, like the purple line. After 60 iteration, you have already at a distance 10 to the minus 5 from the native state. While if you have not enough measurement, like the red curve, you get trapped. So this is the first phase diagram that we get, and here is. So now I show you again the phase diagram in the plane density and number of constraints. Diagonal line, which is the optimal the best possible place, and then the Dono-Tanner curve for the L1 relaxation. And here in the middle, we see that we have the BP threshold. This is for a Gaussian. So it's a Gauss-Bernoulli signal that we are studying with Gauss-Bernoulli. So in some sense, that's the case which is favorable in the sense that we have a good our prior on the signal is good. It's well suited. And so that's good. You see here we have entered this famous forbidden region by iterating the BP equation. It works. But on the right-hand side, we do exactly the same thing. But in this case, I assume that the original signal is binary in the sense that the component, they are from +1, -1 just. Okay, that's a kind of worst case actually that would be. And I study it, I am completely stupid, I have not noticed that, and I study it with a Gauss-Bernoulli prior. So instead of +1, -1 prior, I put a Gaussian. And here you see that in this case, the gain with respect to the L1 is very limited. L1 is not, the L1 relaxation does not care at all about the prior on the signal, but our method does. So basically, the conclusion from that analysis, in some, if you have a good knowledge of the signal, you can gain quite a lot with respect to L1. But in other cases, if you don't have this good description of the signal a priori, that does not help much. Why doesn't it work? The reason why it doesn't work is because of this glass. The measure itself, the crystalline phase exists somewhere, and you have to find it. So, in some sense, that's what we have. That's the next step. That's the third step that I have not described to you, and that I'm coming to now. And the idea of this step was to get around the trap, the glass transition, and the idea was to say, well, what we need to do here, we need to reach a crystalline state. We know that it exists. We know that it dominates the measure. It's just that the system gets trapped. It does not, its dynamics does not create a crystal. And so, if you go to physics, you will realize that in order to build a crystal, you have to nucleate a crystal and let it grow. That's how it's done all the time. And that's what I'll show to you. And actually, I should say that the idea of this nucleation, although it's much better understood in terms of physics and the physics of crystal nucleation, we actually borrowed it from works in error correcting codes. So it gives you how all these fields are interconnected. Nucleation and seeding, that's just to show you on a picture how it goes. That's actually a movie that I took from YouTube. That's a bottle of super cool water. So you can do this experiment probably much better here than in Paris. very cold this winter. But here you leave a bottle outside. If it is pure enough bottle, it will super cool and not freeze. And then at some point, what you do is that you drop some crystal in it. And what you see is that there is at least a partial freeze. It does not fully freeze, but there is a partial freezing of the. See if I can show it again. Yes. So you have this bottle of super cool water. You drop a crystal in it, and then you start to nucleate crystal, or polycrystal in general. Yes, here it is. And you see that it grows, and once it starts, it grows very rapidly. That's crystal nucleation. So that's what we try to do. We decide to design the measurement matrix. So here I am assuming now that I am in a situation where I am able myself to decide on the measurement matrix. Okay, I know I am allowed to design my experiment, and without much constraint. And so what we will do is the following. We will group the variables in structure of blocks, which is a combination of one-dimensional structure and a long-range structure. So here is how it goes. We construct something which is inspired by spatially coupled matrices in coding, and particularly in the work by the group in Banco in the PFL. We have these many subsystems. So we group the variables into subsystems. So here we have five subsystems. For instance, we have 1 million variable, and we have 5 subsystems of 200,000 variable each. Okay, and now we add some coupling between the subsystem, and then we choose the measurement parameter in such a way that we do more measurements on the first subsystem. And it means that because we have more measurement on the first subsystem, when we want to reconstruct, we will have more constraints. In this case, we have larger alpha. And so the first subsystem, if things work well, having more information of it, we will be able to reconstruct the correct value of the variable in the first subsystem. And that will be our nucleus. And then what will happen is that we'll have a large value of alpha in the first one and low values of alpha of the number of measurements in the other one. But because we have first nucleated the crystal in the first subsystem, we will see a wave of nucleation that goes through all that. What does it mean in practice? In practice, we construct the measurement matrix as follows. Before I was telling you, I have all the matrix elements which are independent Gaussian random variables, zero mean, unit variance, for instance. Now I draw the matrix element of F. They are random Gaussian variables, but not identically distributed. They have all zero mean, but the variance is the following. So here you see I have decomposed my system into a certain number of blocks, number of variables, and number of measurements. And I look at the element of F, and what is plotted here is the variance of F. So you see that on the diagonal, I still have variance which is 1. Now, off diagonal, above the diagonal, I have variance J2. Below diagonal, I have variance J1. I have these blocks here in this picture. I have 8 blocks on this picture. Okay, I have grouped my variables into 8 blocks and my measurements into 8 blocks. And now the thing that you will see is that in this case, what I do is that I separate my variables into equal size blocks. So I have L blocks of size n over L. And for the measurement, I do more measurement in the first row. The M1, the alpha 1 is large, and the other ones are small. Okay, that's exactly the implementation of the picture that I was telling you before. So you have to imagine that each such block it involves a large number of variables and of measurement. Okay, it's one variable, one measurement. It's a large block. So I have a combination of a system which involves many variables, many measurements, but also a kind of one-dimensional coupling of these large-size systems. So in physics terms, we have a mean-field system in the sense that everybody is coupled to everybody, but then it is coupled to the next mean-field block and the next one with a one-dimensional structure. And it's the combination, the subtle combination of this mean-field structure and the one-dimensional structure that will be able to create the crystal. So this is exactly how it goes. So we much more measurement. We have size for the number of measurement in the first block. This is a numerical study. So what is shown here, I iterate my so the rest is exactly the thing that I was doing before. I take this matrix, I use my BP equation with this matrix now. Exactly the same thing as before. And now here is the experiment. The experiment gives me the mean square error in each block as function of iterations of the belief propagation of the message passing. So at time 0, I see a big error. And then you see that at time, let's say at time 10, I have completely decoding. I have 0 error in the first block, nearly 0 error in the second block, and then a large error in all the other ones. And then as time progresses, I have this wave of nucleation of my and at t equal 100, I have decoded blocks 1 to 9 perfectly, and the other ones are still bad. And so I'm propagating this wave. So then one can do the analytic study, cavity, and so on and so forth. The cavity tells you, with this thing, in the large size limit, you can reach alpha equal rho. That is, you can reach the perfect diagonal. That is, you can beat this L1 threshold that was described before. This is, in practice, the number of iterations as function of alpha. The original BP curve was the blue one, which was here in this case for equal 0.499. It was trapped at slightly below 0.7. And we see that now we can go down to alpha equal 0.5. So it means that it's alpha equal rho naught, basically. There is So now it's possible to reach the asymptotic limit. And just to give you now the final phase diagram, these are experimental dots now cross one obtained by this seeded matrix. And you see that now we have reached exactly this is experimental. So of course there are finite size effects. That is, the experiment is done with a system which has a finite n, a finite number of blocks, and so on. The theory tells us that in the large n limit, in the large number of block limit, and so on, we reach the diagonal. And in practice, you see something which is very close to the diagonal, both in the case in which we have a good control of we have a good description of the original signal, even in the very bad case where we are putting which is Gauss-Bernoulli for a binary system. If some of you are familiar with the problem, often people plot it in the US notation, the Dono-Tanner notation, which is rho over alpha versus alpha. And that is the Dono-Tanner curve is the bottom one. The L1 is just above. And the one that we get with our seeded matrices is again above. Now, all this was done in a kind of framework in which the signal was IID. Now you can use exactly the same algorithm is written, use other signal. And here we show some example of what happens in a phantom. So we use here the phantom which is on the left. I don't know, can you see it or not? Not very good. Okay, that is a standard picture of a phantom. And then we treat it with first step of R transform. So in the R transform, you have typically one component of the signal, which is a difference of the neighboring pixels, which is 0. So it has some sparsity. So phantom has a sparsity. It has density rho equal 0.15. And now you can see that, well, I don't know if you can see, but I will tell you. The first row, so the pictures, when you go left to right, the number of measurement decreases. So here you have alpha equal 0.5, that is, you have 50% of measurement per variable, and everybody decodes the phantom. L1, BP, and seeded BP. So the top is L1, the intermediate line is just the message passing, and the bottom line is the message passing with the special measurement matrix that we always use. And so now, if you look at it carefully, you will see that L1 degrades as soon as you go between 0.5 and 0.4. Or it's perfect at 0.5, but it's already not good at 0.4. The BP, actually, it's OK for 0.4 and 0.5, but it's not good at 0.3. The seeded BP, it goes all the way to 0.2. So, and that is not this is no longer a system which is IID, random variables, and so on. It's a kind of practical system. And the same thing happens with other pictures, of course. Here is a picture, a standard picture of LENA used in signal processing. That is just to give you an idea. Just one word about discrete tomography. 3 images that we have been studying using some approach to compressed sensing, and they can be reconstructed. They are typically of size between 500 by 500 and 1000 by 1000. We can reconstruct it from a small number of measurements each case. And here the idea is again to use a kind of prior, and the prior that we use is the fact that we assume that neighboring pixels have a larger probability to be rather than to be. So it's what is called an Ising prior. And it has one, and then you can again work out the belief propagation equation with. And it has something which is very nice. It is much more robust to noise with respect to the original problem. And that's something that I have not had time to show you about noise here, but that's something that is also true for the original compressed sensing that I was addressing. Our method turns out to be quite robust to the addition of noise. That is, in this probabilistic setting that we used, we can cope with the addition of noise. Both noise in the definition of the matrix, if it is not perfectly known, and noise in the measurement process. So this is just a summary. Robustness to noise, generalization to approximately sparse signals are things that we have worked out that I have not time to document here. And there are many extensions. Discrete tomography is one of them. Nonlinear measurement is particularly interesting because in this approach that we have, we are no longer bound to L1. So linearity of the measurement, it's not a big deal. We can use nonlinear functions in our measure. It does not change much. The message passing works and so on. So group testing is one example. And then we are working, and we have done some work on the case in which the measurement matrix is not well known and we have to calibrate it, or we have just to learn it by, if we have enough data, to try to learn the matrix at the same time as the signal, which is called dictionary learning, and that's ongoing. So thanks a lot for your attention.